Let's wait another couple of minutes. All right, so I think we'll get started. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. My name is Neil Rogachevsky, Associate Director of the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought at Yeshiva University. And I'd like to welcome you all to this online event hosted jointly by the Strauss Center at Yeshiva and the Jack Miller Center. Thanks to the Jack Miller Center, we've been able to invite a number of interesting speakers, alas only digitally, to address our students over the course of this academic year. And today we decided this event full of so much wide-ranging interest to open this up to others as well. So I'm delighted to see both our students and some others, including some familiar names, familiar faces. It's great to see you all. The Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought at Yeshiva is engaged with great ideas and great books in the Jewish and Western traditions, with an emphasis on texts in philosophy, theology, and politics. And today we turn to that great fount of political understanding, Thucydides, the historian of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta in the 5th century before the Common Era. Now, I was prompted to spend time with Thucydides at the Strauss Center this year by kind of irritation. This was prompted by spending maybe a bit too much time on the internet and seeing many writers and literary critics in response to the coronavirus pandemic, mentioning only a very narrow range of literary references to try to understand the situation. More times than I could count, I saw references to read Albert Camus' The Plague, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera. I saw these books recommended more times than I could count. Whatever the virtues of these works, I thought to myself, come on, guys. You're missing a real heavyweight, perhaps the heavyweight, when it comes to understanding the political meaning of disease. Thucydides, whose portrait of the plague that hit Athens in the early years of the Peloponnesian War, simply an unrivaled account on this score. But Thucydides offers so much more than this, much more than simply about disease and the lessons of disease. And revisiting Thucydides for me after many years, I was simply blown away by both the timeless character of the work and indeed timely lessons he offers for our own political situation. And our guest today, Professor Seth Jaffe, is a wonderful guide to both what is timely and what is timeless in Thucydides. Seth Jaffe is a professor of political science and international relations at Cabot University in Rome, Italy. Now, I warn you, Prof. Jaffe, that one of our yeshiva students wrote a satirical piece in a newspaper earlier this year calling for the cancellation and the destruction of the very triggering Arch of Titus in Rome. So you better watch it. Yeshiva University is coming for your so-called eternal city. Although I don't know, I note that Jaffe did spend a year studying in Jerusalem, so perhaps he'll be spared, or he could be persuaded to join in some good old-fashioned antiquity-style sedition. Jaffe is one of the preeminent Thucydides scholars of his generation, one of the very best working at the moment. He is the author of the 2017 book, Thucydides on the Outbreak of War, Character and Contest, from Oxford University Press, a truly brilliant look at the account of the origins of war in the early pages of Thucydides, an account that has befuddled and perplexed students for just a few millennia. In addition to his interpretive chops, Jaffe has that really rare ability to bring Thucydidean insights, classical insights, you could say, to bear on more timely questions of politics and international affairs. How should we think about growing competition between the United States and China? Jaffe, in some of his writings, has shown us why Thucydides is a vital source, though hardly the only one, for thinking through this grave question we face. Before going to Rome, Jaffe taught at Bowdoin College in Maine, from which he graduated, and at the University of Toronto, where he took his PhD and where he was the inaugural Bloom Fellow in Classics, and where I had the pleasure of getting to know him. The subject of his talk today is Thucydides, Populism, and the Freedom of the Ancients. Now, the event will proceed as follows. Jaffe's going to speak for 45 minutes or so. Afterwards, we'll open up the floor to questions. We have an open Zoom forum here, so we can really do things two ways. If you have questions that come up during the speech, you can use a chat function and pass them to me, and I can ask, or at the end, you can use the raise hand function, and I can simply call on you, whatever your preference is. And Professor Jaffe has kindly agreed to answer both interpretive questions about Thucydides, something has been troubling you in your reading of Thucydides, or or delighting you, or about more general questions of Thucydidean lessons, about populism, even the America-China relationship is fair game. So, and we'll endeavor to end at exactly 5:45 p.m. With that, turn it over, Professor Seth Jaffe.
So first, I would like to thank Professor Rogochevsky for his kind introduction, which is surely more generous than I deserve. I'd also like to thank the Jack Miller Center for sponsoring this event, and also for the Strauss Center for its support. For my part, I'm pleased to be back here at Yeshiva University to speak about Thucydides, populism, and the liberty of the ancients. I enjoyed Zoom guest lecturing in Professor Rogochevsky's Great Political Thinkers course several weeks ago, which meets in this time slot. This afternoon, Professor Rogochevsky has given me two conflicting imperatives. First, he enjoined me not to embarrass myself by presenting a talk that was anything less than great, given the title of his class, which is surely hard enough. But then second, he made it worse by telling me not to make him look bad. So difficult though it will be, I will try to square this particular circle. So a final preliminary. As my study of populism teaches me, the cardinal rule in speaking to a mob, whether in person or online, is to flatter one's audience. For populists forever claim not only to represent the people, but also to love them. So let me open by saying, and I mean this very sincerely, you are the most intelligent, insightful, and even physically beautiful group of people to whom I have ever had the pleasure of speaking. My theme today revolves around how the study of ancient direct democracy can help us to understand or gain purchase on problems faced by contemporary liberal democracy, which is to say by the kinds of political orders we live in today. Given the diversity of this afternoon's audience, including students and faculty and guests from various backgrounds, it's nice to see some familiar faces among the students. I've tried to craft a broadly accessible talk focusing on crowd psychology as a constituent of the profoundly communitarian experience of ancient freedom. Thucydides, for his part, explores this psychology principally through his portrait of the democracy at Athens. In outline, I want to argue that the ancient experience of freedom as a palpably felt form of communal power is at play in today's populism, whether of the left or right, and that this psychological experience has been comparatively neglected in contemporary treatments of the phenomenon. My presentation will surely be more suggestive than definitive, but I hope it will lead to a lively discussion in the question period. And in broad terms, I hope to persuade you that ancient texts can shed light on modern problems, although they will not provide ready-made solutions to our problems. No Thucydides or Plato or Aristotle will solve any of our problems for us. But let me ask all of you a preliminary question as a kind of thought experiment. There's no need to answer me directly, but simply reflect on the following questions, related questions, during my presentation. How many of you have felt powerless before, unable to command or control your own lives? How common is the experience for you? And when you think to yourself that you live in a free society, does that genuinely comfort you? Does it correspond to the way that you feel? In other words, do you all really feel free? We know from our own personal experiences, but also from various studies, that modern peoples frequently feel lonely, isolated, and even depressed. On the basis of an extensive study in the UK, a minister of loneliness was created in 2018 to address the public health crisis of isolation. The pervasiveness of these feelings is something that we don't think about enough, but it is an extraordinary subject to reflect upon. Loneliness as a kind of modern epidemic. In line with our themes today, I heard a talk relatively recently entitled something like, "Did the ancient Greeks get lonely?" The answer was, according to the speaker, very infrequently. And the arresting final line of the talk was something like, "For the ancient Greeks, loneliness is where tragedy began." Today, I want to claim that our feelings of loneliness, depression, and powerlessness, which often go together, make us susceptible to experiencing populism and mass political movements generally as the relieving antidote to these unhappy feelings. In other words, despite the fact that we are constantly told that we are free, we don't feel like we are. And something about populism viscerally speaks to this experience. Think for a moment about how we feel as part of a group, as part of something larger than ourselves, which enfolds us and which channels our interests, our moral concerns, our excitement, or even our anger. What happens in such moments? We are suddenly transported out of ourselves, thrown out of the ambit of our private existences, out of our individual troubles and cares and concerns, and into the wider world, which suddenly appears in a new light. In the way that we normally think of our lives, we escape from the world itself into our private existences. We drink a beer or a glass of wine or fire up our Netflix. But here, in this reverse experience, we escape from our lonely private existence into the warm embrace of the crowd. For a great many, although certainly not for everyone, this experience generates a surge of hopefulness and a charge of energy. It is almost a drug. We feel suddenly that much is possible precisely because we are an element of a living collective, a crowd or a movement, which thinks and feels as we do. To use a final example, which may make some of you nostalgic given this strange COVID-19 moment, think of the crackling energy in a sports arena when thousands of fans are together rooting for their favorite team or against an opposing one. For many, this experience is intoxicating. As a qualification, I should add that it is frightening and in no way energizing to be swept up in a crowd which thinks and feels in ways radically different than we do. This is a profoundly alienating experience. In my presentation today, I want to argue first that it is this intoxication, specifically the pleasurable feeling of energy and power we feel as part of a crowd or movement, which has been comparatively neglected in discussions about the appeal of contemporary populism. And second, that this experience was a normal and regular part of ancient direct democracy, even a core constituent of what the ancients meant by freedom. This will not be a full account of populism, and I will add several other contributing factors, which I believe are baked into the cake, we might say, of contemporary liberal democracy. Moreover, it is an ancient author, Thucydides, who can help us to see these dynamics and who can illuminate certain democratic phenomena, which are obscure to us modern liberal Democrats, precisely because our democracy is representative and not direct. Additionally, our liberalism today, which is a thoroughgoing individualism, risks blinding us to what democracy originally entailed. And here it is the distance between ancient direct self-rule and modern liberal democracy, which helps to shed light on contemporary democratic dynamics, and specifically on the phenomenon of populism. Why Thucydides, you might ask? Well, he is that ancient author who most faithfully recreates the horizon of ancient political life as the actors themselves experienced it. He can thus help us to recover elements of the lived experience of ancient democracy. And unlike Plato or Aristotle, he does not rise so high above actual politics in the direction of philosophical speculation, though Aristotle, I should note, will appear briefly in my conclusion. The lived experience of ancient politics is therefore visible in Thucydides' pages, while his account of the Athenian democracy calls our attention to the close interrelationship between the communal experiences of power and freedom. Various Thucydidean episodes touch upon these themes, but I want to use a selective interpretation of the funeral oration of Pericles as the anchor for my discussion today, since I believe it offers a unique window into the psychology of the Athenian experience of their democracy. I've now made various contentious and contestable assertions, and this just in my first few minutes. So I need to substantiate them more fully in the remaining part of my presentation, which will proceed according to the following plan. First, to orient you, including the students, with regard to our theme, I want to discuss the differences between ancient democracy and modern democracy, in part by introducing Benjamin Constant's well-known 1819 lecture, The Liberty of Ancients Compared with That of Moderns. Second, I will furnish a highly compressed interpretation of the periclean funeral oration, focusing on the connection between power, freedom, and crowd psychology. Third, I will return to the present to outline the problems of contemporary politics, including populism. And then fourth and finally, I'm going to try to bring the threads together to discuss how modern populism would seem to satisfy the experiential dimensions of freedom understood as a kind of felt power. It is this element, what I'm calling an experiential element, which I think is missing in modern diagnoses of populism, which characteristically focus on declining social trust, or the role of social media in nourishing polarization, or on incipient authoritarian leadership, or on the wider failure of liberal democratic institutions themselves. These accounts doubtless capture part of the complex story of the state of contemporary liberal democracy, but not the whole part, or so I will claim. So to anchor the discussion which will follow, I want to introduce a distinction which will be familiar to some of you between the characteristic liberty of the ancients and that of the moderns. The classic statement is contained in a lecture by Benjamin Constant, not delivered by Zoom, entitled The Liberty of Ancients Compared with That of the Moderns, which was delivered at the Royal Athenaeum of Paris in 1819. After a few orienting remarks, I'll provide you with a long quotation from Constant, which will help to illuminate the issues under discussion today. Today, when we speak of liberty or freedom, we generally mean private liberty. In other words, we can worship as we choose or freely express our political opinions. That's my right, we often say, and hear others say. You have probably even uttered the expression yourself at some point, doubtless in a tone of disgruntled moral indignation. We modern liberal Democrats share the expectation that our lives and liberties and properties will be protected by the state. This indeed is the avowed purpose of liberal political orders. It is something we are owed. We also believe that we should be free to find our own happiness, to choose our own life direction without hindrance from others, or more specifically, without being subject to the will of another. For to be controlled by the will of someone else is experienced as tyranny. Some of you students perhaps may feel this way about your parents' rule or control over you, or your finances perhaps. Here, liberty means the absence of intentional interference from others, or what Isaiah Berlin has called negative liberty. At the same time, we also call ourselves free peoples. This means that we are free compared to those who live under authoritarian regimes, in Iran, say, or in China. By this, we mean that sovereignty, ultimate power, resides with the people as a collective, with all of us as citizens, and that our government, again, a liberal democratic one, serves the people and its interests. Serving the people collectively is essentially the same as serving us individually, since we all benefit ideally equally from the common protection of our equal rights. We benefit individually altogether, we might say, or such at least is the aspirational claim of liberal democracy. This focus on rights captures the liberal element of the liberal democratic synthesis, while the democratic part of that synthesis is bound up with elections. Ancient political orders, however, were different. They were quite small compared to the large commercial republics of today. To abridge a complicated story in the history of political thought, to make possible the application of the principle of self-government to so many people and over so much territory, the expedient of representative government was devised. Imagine a deliberative assembly of 330 million Americans. It would be impossible to manage. To realize how impossible, just think about how hard it is for you and say 5 friends to decide in common on a place to go for dinner in New York. This is why ancient direct democracies were limited in size. The solution to the problem of how to have enormous democracies is representation. In representative democracies like those of today, we rule ourselves indirectly through the regular authorization of representatives who stand for us and for our interests. This, again, is what an election is about, and it is why the US Congress, say, is comprised of 535 people and not 330 million people. Let's put these liberal and democratic elements back together. In liberal democracy, we, the people, rule our rulers through elections. while our political system protects or defends a framework of law which safeguards our basic rights. Of course, it is not the political system in some vague sense which protects our rights. It is the machinery of the impersonal state that does so. Well, that machinery is controlled by our representatives, who again serve at our pleasure. It is the liberal state then, the liberal Leviathan, which protects us from one another, from the threat we pose to the rights of our neighbors, but also from the threats posed to our rights by enemies abroad. At the same time, according to John Locke, a founding figure of modern liberalism, we, the people, retain a right of revolution if it is our government, or here we might add the police, that threatens our rights or fails to protect them adequately. In such moments, sovereignty can return more directly to the people. As we will soon discuss, this is an argument populists invariably deploy. Because our representatives do not in fact represent us, we, the people, become forced to advocate for ourselves directly, a subject to which I will shortly return. As I've already suggested, classical Athens, by contrast, and the contrast is quite significant, was a direct democracy, and it was not liberal. There were then no representatives in the distinctly modern sense. Every citizen represented himself directly in the Athenian assembly. Only men were active citizens. The city was small and more homogeneous than today's political orders, something closer to an ethno-national community. There was also no impersonal state, which guaranteed the rights of citizens. Indeed, instead of rights, duty was primary, while every citizen was an equal member of the Athenian assembly. The people themselves, the citizens of Athens, were the city of Athens, and they could and sometimes did engage in what we might call tyranny of the majority, which is to say that there was no constitutional check or break on the will of the majority. In liberal democratic orders, by contrast, majority decisions are limited by the protection of our rights, which are enshrined in our founding documents and in our laws. So with these framing points about the differences between ancient direct democracy and liberal democracy clear in your minds, let me now offer you a quotation from Benjamin Constant, which encapsulates some of these distinctions and which also offers a clue for our theme today. Be a little patient with me. The quotation is lengthy. I'll also give you a few parenthetical comments as I go. So quote, this is Constant. It follows that from what I have just indicated, that we, modern peoples, can no longer enjoy the liberty of the ancients, which consisted in an active and constant participation in collective power. Our freedom must consist of peaceful enjoyment and private independence. The share which in antiquity everyone held in national sovereignty was by no means an abstract presumption as it is in our own day. The will of each had real influence. The exercise of this will was a vivid and repeated pleasure. Note that word, pleasure. Consequently, the ancients were ready to make a sacrifice to preserve their political rights and their share in the administration of the state. Everybody, feeling with pride all that his suffrage was worth, found in this awareness of his personal importance a great compensation. Constant goes on. This compensation no longer exists for us today. Lost in the multitude, the individual can almost never perceive the influence he exercises. In other words, parenthetical, he feels powerless, end parenthetical. Never does his will, the will of a modern person, impress itself upon the whole. Nothing confirms in his eyes his own cooperation. The exercise of political rights, therefore, offers us but a part of the pleasures that the ancients found in it, while at the same time the progress of civilization, the commercial tendency of the age, the communication amongst peoples have infinitely multiplied and varied the means of personal happiness, end quotation. According to Constant, then, our liberty today is fundamentally and almost irrevocably private. And we now have private commercial compensations for this great change between ancient and modern liberty. So, you know, candy bars, fast food, Netflix, yoga lessons, etc. This word compensation, I think, is important. We've lost something in replacing ancient liberty with its modern counterpart, but we have gained still other things. At the same time, we no longer regularly feel pride or pleasure or freedom as a member of a living collective, as part of an active citizen body, though we may perhaps experience something similar as part of a religious community of worship. And to put my own proverbial cards on the table, I think we crave this feeling, and what is more, that populism of the left or of the right satisfies something of this desire. To better draw out the relationship between the experience of collective power and ancient liberty, let me present you with a puzzle. According to the late classical scholar Jacqueline de Romilly, and I quote, "The act of ruling for the Greeks was really considered as the perfect expression of both internal and external freedom, and in fact, as a superior freedom," end quote. Now, how can ruling or empire represent an expression of freedom, let alone a perfect one? From the perspective of modern liberty, which is to say from our perspective, this claim is almost an absurdity on its face. The protection of my rights, my private liberty, has no obvious connection with empire, unless, of course, some of you are Marxists, in which case you can please attack me in the question period. Yet even for the Marxists, these links are structural and so not clearly visible on the level of liberal ideology or daily experience. For ancient Greek citizens, by contrast, the relationship between freedom and empire was, I believe, quite clear. And there was a strangely intimate relationship between internal democratic self-rule and external empire or rule over others for the Athenians of the 5th century BC. What then was that relationship? To answer that question, I want to turn to the periclean funeral oration of Thucydides' history, which offers an idealized portrait of Athens as a vast personal force, a city so terrifically powerful because of the collected virtues of the Athenians themselves. Although I believe the speech itself to be largely a piece of flattery, I think Thucydides wants us to know it is flattery. This, I should note, is a contested claim in the scholarship. The flattery, for my part, I believe, is revelatory of those feelings of elevation, pleasure, and freedom which the ancient democrat experienced as an active participating citizen. According to Thucydides' own assessment of Pericles in a key passage in the second book of the history, Pericles deftly enhanced or deflated the confidence of the demos, while this confidence was anchored in the people's assessment of their power, a theme to which we will return. The funeral oration of Pericles is probably the best known speech in the entire history, and I know the students in the audience have spent some time with it, so I'll be brief in my framing. The setting is a public funeral. In 431 BC, Pericles, the great 5th century Athenian statesman, offers a speech over the first dead of the Peloponnesian War to the assembled Athenians, the full citizen levy, along with foreigners or medics. There are only a few war dead, we can infer from the text. Instead of praising the dead, however, Pericles praises the living. He praises the imperial democratic city. He praises not those who have sacrificed themselves, but the city for which they sacrificed themselves. Of course, the city itself was its citizens and their achievements, and so there is something strangely circular about this Periclean praise. The speech itself involves a great many themes, but the interpretation I will offer is selective, focusing mainly on the role of power. And please don't forget that the Athenians themselves are all assembled for this speech. Pericles, in other words, is generating a communal experience through his rhetoric, and for us as vicarious members of the solemn occasion. To use the proverbial expression, Pericles is working the crowd in order to enhance every Athenian sense of the city's power. Early in the speech, Pericles offers an account of the relationship between honor and power, which I want to focus on. He begins by praising the ancestors, but he implies that the present generation is worthy of the greatest honor, for the city stands at the height of its power. In the speech, honor follows power. The ancestors are to be honored for having handed down Athens and Attica free, a consequence of their virtue. The maintenance and handing down of a free city, in other words, this is freedom from external rule, is praiseworthy. Worthy of more, he continues, is empire, or rule over others. Worth more than these both is that enhancement of power which makes the imperial city self-sufficient in war and peace. As we would expect, the presentation is highly democratic. Athenian virtue is common across whole generations, while the present generation represents a terrific crescendo of it, corresponding to the city's wonderful imperial peak. According to Thucydides, Athens was at the peak of its power on the eve of the Peloponnesian War. On my reading, the Periclean rhetorical intention is to enhance the demos's perception of its own kratos, a word which means strength, power, or control, demokratia, from whence our word democracy in the quite literal sense. Pericles then is firing every citizen's sense of the city's power. The occasion is somber, of course, it is a funeral, but the energy in 431 BC in the crowd must have been powerful and electric. Now, if power is viewed as emanating from the collective virtues of citizens, then praising power is identical with praising the virtues which generated it. And this is what Pericles does in his speech. For Aristotle, of course, a later thinker, it is the city itself, which is the self-sufficient or independent partnership, embracing every dependent one. By light of Pericles' rhetoric, however, it is not every city, but rather only the imperial one that is truly self-sufficient, precisely because it is allegedly free of the dangers posed by other cities. It is power, and power alone, which allows the Athenians to slip the leash of those constraints binding weaker cities, to ward off threats to their freedom, and to be able to rule over others. By periclean lights, the strongest city, the most powerful city, is freest by virtue of this fact. While for Pericles, the best regime, the best political order, we might say, is an empire. The bigger, the better. The most powerful empire, then, the Athenian empire, manifests the most virtue, for power is pooled citizen virtue, the aggregate of individual Athenian power. In her imperial prime, Athens is free because of her power, which is the very same power that allows her to rule over others. Athens is a vast personal force, and freedom is one with power. To maintain the freedom of their city, ancient citizens sometimes had to prove that they were capable of defending themselves against those who would deprive them of their freedom. This the Athenians did spectacularly at the time of the Persian Wars. Together, they fought off the barbarian invader, first at Marathon, and then some 10 years later at Salamis, Plataea, and Artemisium. Again, there was no state and no professional army. The Athenians collectively fought for their own freedom. It is characteristic of our modern focus on rights, or what we are owed, instead of duty, what we owe our community, that we today believe that we are owed freedom and that a modern state should ensure it for us. The ancient citizen did not think like this. Freedom had to be won by virtue, by power. Ancient citizens had to be able to protect and defend their own freedom. To be and remain free, therefore, required power, citizen power. So let's turn our attention for a moment to those Athenian citizens listening to the Periclean speech. In one of the most famous lines of the funeral oration, Pericles exhorts the Athenians to become lovers of the city by gazing daily upon its great power. But the power Pericles exhorts the Athenians to love is a power testifying to the Athenians themselves. He invites his audience to love themselves by loving the imperial city that they have built and rebuilt together. Here, self-love and patriotism converge almost seamlessly, which perhaps tells us something interesting about patriotism itself. At the same time, contemplation of the city's power, a power visible through the eyes, Pericles presumably intends the gaudy and impressive spectacle of the Athenian Acropolis. This vision, this power visible through the eyes, extends every Athenian's view of the city's reach and also of his individual reach. But what is really happening here? Through his emphasis on the power of Athens and the virtues of her citizens, Pericles is boosting Athenian confidence or courage, something it is obviously important to do in wartime. If you think about it for a moment, confidence, assuming it is not mere boasting, necessarily involves an assessment of power or capacity. The confident person believes that she will succeed because her power or capacity or virtue is sufficient to whatever task. In this way, confidence nourishes hope by inoculating human beings against the specter of failure. By focusing so unremittingly on Athenian power, Pericles moreover enhances the desires of the collected Athenians, precisely because they feel confident and capable of achieving whatever they set their minds to, which causes their desires to magnify. Stated as simply as possible, Pericles establishes a courage-making cycle by rhetorically manipulating the reciprocal relationship between power and desire. The Athenians are courageous or confident then because they desire things existing above and beyond the ranks of the enemies who oppose them. It is confidence in their own power which drives the Athenians through the ranks of their enemies toward the objects of their hopes. They are at once propelled forward by faith in their own power and drawn onward by desire. It is these collective desires which issue forth in Athenian imperialism in the desire to rule over others. To address de Romilly's puzzle about freedom squarely then, for the ancient Democrat, empire represents the perfect form of freedom because it represents the highest manifestation of the community's ability to achieve the objects of desire and to ward off evil. It is power and power alone which confers freedom and empire. It was the common and regular experience of their own power which made the Athenians feel free. To feel free, in other words, entails feeling powerful. One common Greek word for power is dunamis, which means of being able to do something. In feeling capable, able, or powerful together, the Athenian citizens felt free. And in feeling free, they felt powerful. Freedom and power are then tightly linked for the classical Athenian of the 5th century. So let's return from the shadowy mists of the past to our moment and cast our eyes upon the political landscape in America and Europe. And then we can try to gain purchase over the phenomena of contemporary populism. One only has to turn on the news or open a web browser to see warning signs of the fraying legitimacy of liberal democratic orders. Almost 30 years after the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis seems far more intimately bound up with the triumphalism of that moment, the self-congratulatory glow of the victory of liberal democracy over communism, than reflective of any genuine historical dialectic. The rise of fascistic echoes in Europe, as you know, as Professor Rogochevsky mentioned, I live and teach in Italy, where those echoes are especially resonant, not only reflects a forgetting of the dangers and failures of fascism, but also, I think, a forgetting of fascism's visceral appeal, the powerful attraction of a personal mass politics. Corresponding to the declining trust in our official representatives is a growing trust in political outsiders, both non-traditional politicians and also anti-system parties. I should add that the decline of our trust in establishment media tracks along with the increasing fragmentation of our media landscape, to say nothing of the influence of the rising speed of communication, as well as algorithm-driven polarization, which are both intimately bound up with our dominant social media platforms, to say nothing of the potential interference of outside actors, Russian Twitter bots, etc. So let's very briefly take the 2016 American election as a case in point. A TV celebrity, a businessman, and a one-time Democrat, Donald J. Trump, took over the Republican Party heart and soul, while a lifelong independent senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, came within a hair of dethroning one of the most respected establishment politicians in recent memory in Hillary Clinton. This is the 2016 Democratic primary. Trump, the non-traditional politician, of course, defeated Clinton for the presidency in 2016. That is a whole lot of anti-establishment juice in the system. Biden's recent victory may appear to some to signify a return to politics as usual, but I believe that would be an error or a mistake. In the growing anti-politics of our moment, conventional or establishment politicians are invariably styled the agents, if not the puppets, of special interests, or of bureaucrats, or of bankers, or of globalists, or of the deep state, or of whomever. Or alternatively, the agents of white supremacy, the patriarchy, or the billionaire class. And maybe our politicians are, in fact, puppets of one or more of these interests. But even if they are not, outsider candidates are everywhere in vogue, and this trend shows no sign of abating. The politician as savior, whether self-appointed or anointed by others, is increasingly the norm. In my view, this promises to lead to further voter dissatisfaction. Why? Because such savior politicians will inevitably disappoint us, which will lead to greater disaffectation, which will whet our appetite for still another savior politician, and so on. For it is easy to promise the moon and harder to deliver the cheese. And it is, in part, the persistent disappointment of the public's hopes which fuels cynicism about politics. This hunger for salvation, however, is surely whetted by the deep-seated feeling that something is fundamentally awry. And thus these new politicians, with their claims of a world gone wrong, are trusted by voters, or more modestly, voters are willing to give them a chance, precisely because some very significant chunk of the electorate feels that something is in fact profoundly wrong, even if there is wild divergence between left and right about what has gone wrong, why things have gone wrong, and what it would look like for things to go right. When felt anger and dissatisfaction are ascendant, the question of who will create a compelling narrative explaining and channeling the popular anger becomes a question of genuine political importance. The vast megaphone of President Trump's now defunct Twitter profile is a case in point, and so too his Stop the Steal movement, whose unruly members attacked the American Capitol at the president's bidding over a month ago. Events of this sort have led scholars to coin the term democratic deconsolidation. This refers to the progressive breakdown or unwinding of liberal democracy itself. For those of you who may not know, democratic consolidation is a well-known literature in comparative politics, which details a process whereby democratic institutions become locked into place, creating a kind of democratic path dependency. Once you go a certain distance down this democratic road, or so the argument runs, you simply will not go back. Two scholars, Foa and Monk, have challenged this claim in some off-cited pieces in the Journal of Democracy in 2016 and 17, respectively. They raised the specter of democratic deconsolidation based on world values survey data. Extensive survey data supports the claim that global respect for liberal democracy as a regime is declining and has been declining for some time, while there has been an appreciable rise in support for non-democratic alternatives, especially among the young, among the people of the generation of the students here in the Zoom audience today. The bugbear of our present discontent goes by the name of populism. Some commentators have suggested that this term itself is a hazy one, which obscures more than it reveals. Populism, as generally conceptualized by scholars, corresponds to a style of politics, or alternatively, a thin ideology, one involving a popular leader figure who advocates for the people over and against corrupt elites. The right-wing populist defines the people and elites in one way, of course, while the left-wing populist does so in another way. The substance is different, but their formal claims are similar. Bad elites are taking advantage of the good people, and the people, in mass, need to do something about it. We can talk about the construction of the people in the question period if you wish, since different populists naturally mean different things by the people. Now, popular dissatisfaction with liberal democracy could be rising for many reasons. Perhaps, for example, because our elites, however defined, are in fact failing the people and have been for some time. This surely is what every populist claims. Well, maybe they are right. In other words, our political orders no longer actually or sufficiently safeguard the interests of the people, and so the people are reasonably angry. Alternatively, the people no longer believe that elites adequately safeguard their interests, and so again, the people are angry. In either case, the problem is real, and it is intimately bound up with simmering anger and discontent. The people then either rightly mistrusts an untrustworthy government, or they wrongly mistrust a trustworthy one. Regardless of which of these is true, there is a big legitimacy problem here, and it is growing. How do we explain it? The causes of the dissatisfaction with liberal democracy are surely complex and varied, but certain threads associated with our themes today can be helpfully identified. In terms of the institutional machinery of liberal democracy itself, I want to suggest that direct democracy, the original form of democracy, is the shadow forever haunting the footsteps of representative democracy, which it simply cannot shake. Let me explain what I mean. Like ancient democracies, modern liberal democracies embrace the view that ultimate power, what we today call sovereignty, resides with the people, understood as all of the people, the citizens, taken together. At the same time, liberal democracies immediately and intentionally shy away from the direct rule of the people through the already discussed mechanism of representation. From the liberal democratic perspective, our rulers, our representatives, are our servants, and we can and do throw them out on their ears in regular elections if we disapprove of the way that they have represented us. We, the people, thus exercise our ultimate power, but we do so only indirectly through elections. And we moreover do so in isolation from our fellows. No one is allowed in the voting booth with you. But here then is the institutional space for the populist move, the permissive institutional cause, we might say. Whether of the left or of the right, populists assert that our representatives are not truly representing us. Instead, they represent elites or special interests. And so the people must respond to this corruption by expressing their voice directly, since again, the people retain ultimate power. Populist leaders then claim that the mechanism of representation itself has broken down or has been corrupted, and so the people must reassert their power directly. The very same thing follows, incidentally, that citizens must assert their power directly if the people come to believe that an election has been stolen and the courts are now somehow rigged. If true, this would mean that the people's will is being ignored, a cardinal sin in liberal democratic orders. In such circumstances, what recourse do citizens have? The answer is simple: mass movements or mass protests. Let me now try to bring the threads of my talk together, and then we can open things up for questions. It was T.S. Eliot, the modernist poet, who coined the expression vast impersonal forces to describe the motion of modern history, which he brightly contrasted with Greek history and theory. As Eliot writes in 1948 in Notes Toward the Definition of Culture, and I quote, "The advantage of the study of Greek history and Greek political theory as a preliminary to the study of other history and other theory is its manageability. It has to do with the human passions of individuals rather than with those vast impersonal forces which in our modern society are a necessary convenience of thought, and the study of which tends to obscure the study of human beings. I would supplement Eliot's lines here by adding that Greek history and theory also has to do with the passions of individuals as they relate to mass psychology. Eliot's expression, vast impersonal forces, moreover, neatly captures the Hobbesian conception of the character of the Leviathan, the classic statement of the purpose of the modern state, which, quote, rules over all of the children of pride and which ensures our rights. We might even go so far as to say it was Thomas Hobbes, a reader and translator of Thucydides, who systematically separated freedom and power, which had been so tightly joined together in ancient politics. Perhaps he was even inspired by the Thucydidean or periclean account of classical Athens as a pooling of power. For as a pooling of power, the Hobbesian Leviathan rises high above each individual as an impersonal force. That indeed is its function, a necessary function, Hobbes claims, if the state is to be able to safeguard our rights effectively. And perhaps unsurprisingly, from the classical Greek perspective, the despotism of the Hobbesian sovereign is evocative of the despotism of the tyrant. So how does any of this relate to populism? Well, the formulation of my title today, Vast Personal Forces, is of course the very opposite of Eliot's vast impersonal forces. For the ancient Democrat, there was no state and no impersonal force. There was only the personal force of the people, the demos assembled, a people proudly unified in civic pride, which was bound up with their common appreciation of the power or capability of their city, which reflected the pooled power or virtues of the citizens themselves. As the funeral oration of Pericles makes clear, the Athenians assembled were the only Leviathan that mattered. In modern liberal democracies, by contrast, the profoundly communitarian elements of ancient direct democracy have been lost, and I would argue forgotten, and along with them, the experience of freedom as a palpably felt form of communal power. In Thucydides, however, and in Greek politics generally, freedom and active citizenship are bound together. Indeed, it was the slave for the Greeks who experienced politics as a vast external force. Free peoples, by contrast, commanded their own destinies. I suspect that an Athenian from the 5th century, if they were transported to the present, would deny that we liberal democratic citizens are in fact free. The Athenian citizen then experienced Athens and the empire as a personal force, with each citizen a vital participating element. Although the point is basic, its meaning should not be lost. The citizens who together comprise the demos, the people, experienced their common power quite frequently. While this communal experience was an integral part of what was meant by freedom. And it was not only pleasurable, as Benjamin Constant has helpfully reminded us, but it was also ennobling. It satisfied a longing for self-respect and pride. To modify a distinctly modern slogan, for the ancient Democrat, the political was the personal. For Aristotle, I told you he would return in my conclusion, human beings are political animals who find their flourishing in explorations of justice and advantage with their fellows, who flourish as participating members of a political community, of a polis, of a city. In modern liberal democracies, by contrast, human beings are conceived of as apolitical or asocial, which is how we justify our modern social contract, whereby individually free men and women consent to form a society and government for the protection of their private rights. In other words, modern liberty, as we have discussed, requires a private space for individuals, which is safeguarded by the power of the impersonal state. Now, contemporary populism, I want to claim, is nourished by a return or a resurgence of the political impulse in the distinctly Aristotelian sense. It is the revenge of a stifled and untutored communitarianism. If this is true, if I'm right in my surmise, then populism represents a longing for the experience of direct democracy within modern representative democracy, a longing for the lost or forgotten feeling of freedom as power, which represents a kind of antidote or drug to the pervasive feelings of powerlessness experienced by so many modern citizens. In other words, just as I earlier maintained that direct democracy is a shadow forever haunting the footsteps of representative democracy, I now want to claim that ancient liberty is a shadow forever haunting the footsteps of modern liberty, which it too cannot shake. Stated simply, we liberal Democrats are constantly told that we are free and that we live in free societies, but we don't actually feel like it, and we want to feel free. Indeed, we even feel entitled to the feeling. Perhaps the wealthy do genuinely feel free, for money is a form of power, But for the rest of us, we feel free. We get a taste of ancient freedom at least, and we like the taste when we become part of a crowd or a movement, part of a personal force. It is, I believe, the longing for a more personal politics and for a sense of control in a world that feels so out of control, which explains something important of the psychological appeal of contemporary populism. Precisely because populism gives us a sudden jolt of apparent power and control. What I am discussing today are felt needs. I don't intend to suggest, I don't mean to suggest they can be satisfied on the plane of fact, or even that many of today's populist variants are justified or just in the moral sense. But politics itself is largely about felt needs, and so we ignore them at our peril. To sum up, I believe that the contemporary resurgence of populist energies today taps into a groundswell of felt powerlessness in the face of Eliot's vast impersonal forces, whether it's the market, the state, etc., and to the attendant longing for the experience of communal power, for the lost feeling of freedom itself. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take some questions or perhaps to endure your recriminations.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Seth Jaffe. I have a couple of questions, but I can open. Let's open it up. Questions, comments. Feel free to either message me or you could use the hand raise function if you're proficient in Zoom. Questions, comments.
There's surely much that was questionable.
I'll go. Okay, Yehuda Goldberg.
Hi, thank you for, first of all, Professor Jaffe, for the really thought-provoking talk. The two sort of civilizations that you focused on, Greek civilization and American civilization, sort of society, both have in them sort of an individualistic strain. In America, it's the world of Tocqueville and his thoughts. And I'm wondering the extent to which you think that this drive of populism towards every person having this ultimate freedom is a specific towards the American context or the Greek context, if it's a broader sort of human need, and what sort of the origins of that need really are.
So I think it's a tough question, and there's something joined in my talk that I can maybe try to separate out as I try to tackle the question, for which I thank you. One question about what I said is, am I arguing that there's something about human beings where we feel the need to be in relation with other human beings? So again, does Aristotelian communitarianism somehow speak to us and to the needs of human beings in a profound way? And that satisfaction, that we do not find that satisfaction in more individualistic political orders? Or am I arguing that when we feel powerless, we feel the need to feel powerful? Because again, you could feel powerful, and a wealthy individual might feel capable or able or powerful. So am I arguing that populism is characterized by communitarianism on the one hand, the stifled need to be a part of something with others? Or am I claiming that there is a desire here for power in the face of powerlessness, and one way that people can feel powerful is through a community? I think what I want to suggest here is, and again, I don't think that my talk establishes this in any definitive way. I think I want to argue that there's something about communitarianism that is true. And there's a way in which contemporary America, at least in its current manifestation, is not satisfying that human impulse. As you may know, there are studies. There's the famous book by Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone, about the shrinking of American civic associations. For Tocqueville, associations were a kind of antidote to what he called individualism, which was bound up with the kind of despotism that we might experience in our modern moment. And so perhaps Americans could find the satisfaction of this impulse in Rotary clubs, in churches, in synagogues, in communal activities that were more robust than those that we have today, and they wouldn't manifest themselves politically. But I think what I want to argue is there's something about American individualism that doesn't satisfy a fundamental human need. And in the present moment, there are a number of other elements that have exacerbated or encouraged that impulse to find a satisfaction in these mass movements, something like that.
Ruben Hartman.
So we spoke in class about Cleon the Demagogue, and we spoke about how the evil nature of a demagogue, I guess, which similar kind of seems to touch upon populism a little bit in its ability to say what the people need to hear to gain power. But that's speaking again on the individual, not the demos. But I think my question is, I think nowadays there's also a conversation on how our current party system in America creates this bipartisanship, which in nature is toxic. What do you think? How do you think that plays in as the worst evil in relationship between a demagogue versus parties that try to play towards the people?
I think it's a hard question. I should just say one thing about Cleon as an example. For those of you who don't know, Cleon is the demagogue in Thucydides' pages, but many people have claimed Pericles was a demagogue. I mean, is a statesman disliked, a democratic statesman disliked, called a demagogue? So it's not so easy to distinguish. I mean, Joe Biden is a populist in a way, right? He received the most votes. And if you receive the most votes, you must be popular. So how do we distinguish between a populist and another kind of democratic politician who must appeal to the people in order to be elected? This is not an easy question. And I do think there are various other elements at play besides this desire for a certain form of power or control over our lives, in the sense that things are slipping out of our control. One of them is surely this thing called polarization. If you've been studying the Thucydides, you know the famous account of faction or stasis in the third book, which involves the breakdown of political order, and where we see political speech weaponized. Speech is no longer used to deliberate in common about a shared future, but instead speech becomes another weapon or tool in the fight between groups that are radically opposed. I think there is a process. Modern polarization represents a kind of version of ancient stasis or faction. It has not manifested itself as violently as ancient civil war, stasis or faction, did. But I think that there is something profoundly problematic about the character of today's polarization, which is encouraging or fueling the breakdown of the existing system. In terms of the demagogue, just a final word here, at least in the way that scholars define populism, there is a way in which the populist, in appealing directly to the people, is often criticizing existing institutions as broken. And so there's something about their rhetoric that leads to an attempt to develop a more personal connection with their followers. And so one of the ways that you can generate a more personal connection with your followers is to castigate the existing system. If the existing system is broken, then your followers need you to help them. And you uniquely are able to help them, or so every populist claims. So I would say that the demagogue is perhaps characterized by a style of rhetoric or a form of rhetoric that contributes to the breakdown of the functioning of the political order in question. I don't think that's a totally satisfying answer, but I think there's something of that in this term demagogue that we could hold on to.
Natan Ehrenreich.
Thank you so much for your time, Professor Jaffe. I'm curious what you think the dominant force is, specifically why now that populism is rising, especially in the United States. You kind of framed it as a result of representative democracy. I would argue the United States has been doing representative democracy successfully for a decent amount of time, especially in the latter half of the 20th century. We had, a period of sustained happiness and success in America, the Reagan presidency through Clinton. So I'm curious, you mentioned 2015. Why 2015 when Donald Trump was elected? Or maybe you take it to 2010 with the rise of the Tea Party, or wherever you want to identify that the trend of really advanced populism. Why now? And then if I could I'm curious also what you think. You mentioned loneliness in the beginning. I'm curious how you think that plays into the pandemic, and this year specifically, how those forces may be rising, and how you think that might affect populism going forward. Thank you.
So I think it's an excellent question, or excellent two questions. And so the question is, okay, Professor Jaffe, so you say that representative democracy doesn't scratch some uniquely human itch. Well, the United States has existed for a couple of hundred years now, so why does this particular itch manifest itself now? I think that's an important question. I would say there have been past moments in the history of the country where we have seen these kinds of tendencies, the resurfacing of a certain direct appeal to the people. There's obviously a civil war. There's the original populist movement in the latter part of the 19th century. So I think that there are political moments in American history when these forces become more ascendant. But I think your question is a more than fair one. So even if the system, if you buy what I'm saying, that institutionally the populist appeal is always there, which is to say our representatives aren't representing. But then there's a moment of time in the history of the country where people seem to be okay with their representatives. Things seem to be going pretty well. Now, there are many different accounts of what has gone wrong in the contemporary moment. One argument is an argument about economic globalization, that people don't feel in control of their own lives. They don't know why their good job just disappeared, why Detroit is booming one day and is no longer booming the next. And so you can make economic arguments. Left populists tend to make economic arguments. Right populists argue that it's government overregulation that is preventing human flourishing. What I would just flag in this particular moment is that both the left and the right think that something is wrong. So then the question becomes, well, what is wrong? What is encouraging this more direct form of human engagement with politics? And I think there are a number of things. I think I buy something of the economic argument that the contemporary inequality of our moment, and this is not an economic determinism, there are many other things that are at play, but that it's driving a pervasive form of insecurity, and that insecurity is nourishing and supporting populists. You see this in Europe as well. Those who have not won by globalization, the coasts have won in the United States, rural areas are suffering more and more. There have been changes in the country that have generated political movements where the disaffected members of the country tend to support populist candidates. So I'm sympathetic to the economic argument. I think there is probably truth to the claim that we're becoming more and more isolated. I don't know if it's the result of our devices, if it's a decline in civic culture. This is the bowling alone thesis, that people are not engaged in activities that bring them close to other human beings, and that this has been a trend across time where the way in which we associate with one another is breaking down. But I would suggest that in the contemporary moment, an itch is not being scratched. And I think that COVID, in a way, has put a lid on some of these populist political movements, but it's also nourished a lot of the same feeling, a profound isolation, a frustration, a sense that we're out of control of our own lives. I suspect that's something that also nourishes conspiracy theories. Again, I'm speaking at a high level of generality, but a conspiracy theory is a way of simplifying the world so that we can have some purchase on it. And I think when we feel out of control in some way, it becomes very easy to attach ourselves to a narrative or to attach ourselves to a movement that gives us a feeling that we're not alone, that we have some control, that we have a way of understanding what is happening to us. The other thing that I think I would put before you, in addition to this economic argument that I think I'm sympathetic to, is I do really think that probably our social media platforms have encouraged a polarization and a further breakdown. That the way algorithms work, the way in which, and also the way all media sources, every dime of internet revenue, every dime of television revenue involves advertising, involves selling you to an advertiser. And there's a lot of incentives to generate conflict, because there are studies that show that when we're angry, when we're frustrated, that hooks us on a station, on a channel, on a series of articles, just as much as if we are happy about the article in question. So I suspect there's something about our social media platforms and the character of the internet that is a big accelerant to these kinds of processes.
Seth, Pericles makes the Athenians conscious of their freedom, you might say, but he also makes them drunk on their freedom, so much so that they go on to do all these kinds of crazy, irrational things on the basis of the view of freedom of an empire that he advances. I'm wondering if you could say to what extent, maybe from that point of view, the modern approach represents a correction, or even, you brought up Aristotle's view of deliberation towards justice rather than power represents a kind of correction to the periclean view.
No, I think it's a very good point. One of the things I said is I mentioned an untutored communitarianism. So I'm someone who believes that the Athenian democracy was not always and forever tyranny of the majority. It was not always a mob. I think there are moments where the Athenians assembled together as citizens made very good decisions, were characterized by restraint. They engaged in genuine democratic deliberation in the best of senses. But I do think this idea of a crowd becoming intoxicated or drunk is also the source of democratic overreaching to some extent. There is a way in which the demos as a crowd can be moved by its anger or fear, because I think crowd psychology is not exactly individual psychology. And when you talk about being drunk as a member of the crowd, if you think about it, one of the things that's interesting about crowds is the extent to which they become almost delirious. If you look at the mob that stormed the Capitol, the enthusiasm, the excitement, there is a sense that crowd behavior is intoxicating, and I use that word at several points. And so I think that there is something about crowd behavior that is in fact intoxicating. Now, most of the writings we have from the 5th century in Greece are from elite critics of democracy. And they tend to style the demos, the people, as a kind of tyrant, on the analogy of the individual tyrant, which is to say someone so inflated by their power, so drunk on their power, that they make all sorts of bad decisions. And for Aristotle famously says that law is intellect without passion, because passion is dangerous. One of the reasons we're not judges in our own case is that we're partial, we're partisan. And if Professor Rogachevsky harms me, I'm angry about it. And we don't think clearly when we're angry. So one of the dangers with crowd behavior, this is the untutored crowd in some way, or when the crowd is stimulated by its leader in order to engage in unruly forms of behavior, at this moment, the passions are ascendant. And so I think that at least in ancient democracy, in ancient political orders, this is why Aristotle emphasized the rule of law as a salutary restraint on the dangerous passions that a crowd could manifest if they weren't checked by the salutary restraint of law or by norms that supported the law, the so-called unwritten nomoi. That's the ancient Greek term for culture in the support of the laws.
Carly Harold.
Hi. Okay. Hi. Thank you very much for allowing.
Hi, Carly.
Hi, Seth. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk, and for allowing to Yeshiva for allowing interlopers from other universities. So I was thinking just a bit about the emphasis that you placed in analyzing Pericles' speech on the empowering aspect of it, right? That the helping or encouraging the people to think about and soak in the power that the empire gives them, and therefore giving them some control. And that being something that they and perhaps we also seek and want and need. But you also discussed, the communitarian aspect of it. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how the desire and the need for control on the one hand and for power is connected to or interacts with that desire for devotion to something that's greater than oneself. Because in a way, one might see those two things as in tension with each other, right? Your desire to be part of something bigger that guides you and that you're a part of, that's not just about you and your interests. And on the other hand, that desire for power and control that one has. Now, of course, it may be just part of human nature that we desire things that are in tension with each other, and perhaps that's just it. But Pericles' speech seems to appeal to and engage with both of those aspects or both those desires. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how they work together in the psychology that Thucydides is presenting to us.
Well, there's a quotation from Mark Twain that I like, which goes something like, "I was pleased to be able to respond promptly. I said, I don't know." But let me try to tease out what you said. I think you're right. There is, in fact, something of reminding of religion in the funeral oration. There is a sense that the community or the city is something greater than the individual Athenian, and that, but as you know, at the same time, death in battle is presented as a kind of gateway to the individual's own apotheosis, the greatest possible individual satisfaction, that the individual receives a measure of eternal fame in dying for the city of Athens that is worth more than their lives, which is to say it's not a sacrifice, in fact. It's to the benefit of the Athenian who sacrifices themselves to sacrifice themselves, because they're winning a lot more, they're gaining a lot more by having done so. At the same time, I think you're right. I think that it's not just an interest bargain that holds the Athenians together as Athens. There's something greater about that collective that rises above the city. And I think there is a devotion to that thing. You know, I mentioned before that perhaps in an overly glib way, that religious community can perhaps satisfy something of these longings. I do think there's something about participating and feeling oneself part of something greater than oneself, but one is also a part of that thing that I think is true to our experience. I think maybe when we tease it apart more philosophically, perhaps it becomes more incoherent, but I do have a sense that the Athenians were devoted together, but it was to an idea of themselves. Now, the question of what this eternal fame is doing, this, for those of you who are less familiar with the funeral oration, is the reward that Pericles holds up as the reward for the sacrifice of oneself in battle, that the Athenians will be remembered as part of this vast personal force. And yet we only remember, of course, Pericles' name. We don't remember the names of any of these other individual Athenians. So there is something odd about that. But I don't have a good answer to this question, but I think you're right that this issue of contributing to something larger than oneself is very much part of the Periclean appeal. I don't have a better answer, I'm afraid.
I'm going to get one more in quickly. Professor Jaffe volunteered kindly to stick around in case, because I do see there are a couple more questions. So we keep going. But if you guys have to run, I'll just let's get this last one in quickly, and then we can end the formal section of this. This is from Thomas Cleveland. Montesquieu, writer near and dear to my heart, says, quotes Cleveland, "Political liberty is that tranquility of spirit which comes from the opinion each one has of his security." In Professor Jaffe's view, do citizens turn away from liberalism because they feel themselves insecure, or is it caused by psychic forces that grow even when they do feel secure?
I think this is a tough question, because it goes back to the student question that was asked, which is, you know, in times that are good economically, do we not see populist energies? And if we don't, doesn't that suggest that the secure enjoyment of our private liberty does in fact satisfy us? And when we become unhappy are those moments where we're no longer able in security to enjoy our private liberty with a modicum of comfort. My suspicion is that I'll put my cards on the table, but I can't prove this. It's more of a bald assertion. But I would say that I think that modern liberty doesn't satisfy human nature. I think that's where I would put my cards on the table. I do think that Carly's question about the matter of devotion, the things that are higher than us and higher than our own individual aims, even our collective aims as citizens, things that are higher or greater than us, that too is a part of human nature. And so I think I'd like to respond to that question by saying that there's something that doesn't satisfy us about modern liberty. But it would be wrong to deny that when economic times are good, we see less of this kind of disruption. we see less of the appeal to a populist or a more personal style of politics. We don't see mass movements to the same extent. So that's a mark in favor of the claim that modern liberty satisfies us.
All right, that's a great note. While we have everyone here, let's give Professor Jaffe a warm round of Zoom applause for this marvelous presentation, truly thought-provoking and magisterial even in his account. So if you guys got to run on for whatever your evening, this is great to, we'll see you next time, those enrolled in class, and otherwise, thank you all for joining us. But as I said, stick around. If there's other questions, happy to, we can go a bit longer. Okay, Seth, we got a question here from Jack Gupre. Is modern freedom a shadow of ancient? I think we covered that in the response to Cleveland. So Seth, you mentioned Tocqueville. So Tocqueville's two traditional remedies to the problem of vast impersonal forces. When I hear vast impersonal forces, I think of Tocqueville rather than T.S. Eliot, a much more credible, respectable source, if you ask me. But his two remedies are civic engagement, as you say, participation in politics at the local level or the state level, and even aspiration to rule through institutions, and religion, and private religion, but the ennobling public character of religion as it's manifested itself in America. With those weakening, this is a more polemical question, you could say. What are the prospects of reviving that sort of sense, of satisfying that part of the human soul, which you've so brilliantly identified? Is there any other prospect but these mass movements, sort of pop psychologists of various kinds and quacks? Do you see any prospects of a rechanneling of those energies through more Tocquevillian means, or are we just beyond that?
These are tough questions. I would say this, that originally I had a chunk in the paper on Tocqueville because actually many people use Eliot's term to refer to Tocquevillian individualism or the tyranny of the administrative state and things of this sort. So we talked a little bit about, one of Tocqueville's antidotes to the feeling of individual powerlessness, the danger of sort of retreating into one's private life, is this kind of associations. And I think that's interesting. He also, by the way, and I mentioned the wealthy here, I think I could have gone into it further. Tocqueville claims aristocrats, of course, had great power. They were able to do things. So for Tocqueville, at least, the suggestion is communitarianism is an instrument whereby the people overcome their powerlessness, not that the communitarian impulse is somehow embedded in human nature. It's a kind of means through self-interest, rightly understood, where we can gain some purchase on a world as a small actor who, through pooling our power with others, can achieve common aims or common objectives. And for Tocqueville, the aristocrat has sort of, great capability here. I do think, you could make the argument, I think it's not a crazy argument at all, that the decline in the American small town, right? The traditional story is you have a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker, and they all shop at one another's places, and that puts money into the community. And therefore there is local engagement. But when we become wage laborers in a Walmart or we work in an Amazon factory, we lose the ability to take responsibility for the small family-owned restaurant that is our own, the hardware store. In Italy, you still see a lot more of the communitarian spirit. It's very interesting in Italy. You have, again, many greengrocers, many butchers. These are all family-owned. You see the same thing in Greece and in other Mediterranean countries. And there is a much stronger communitarian spirit. Economically speaking, I don't know how you do this, but I think making people stakeholders probably is a kind of antidote to this. I do suspect that conspiracy theories and mass movements are an attempt to satisfy a felt need, as I've discussed it. in terms of solutions, again, I think making people stakeholders, I mean, that's a generic way of talking, but I think it matters. What I would just say is, I don't think, when I looked at the literature on this and tried to think about what Thucydides could offer, without trying to say that they're ancient solutions to modern problems, without making it overly simple, one of the things that struck me is that this is not often talked about, these questions, in terms of felt needs. The way these things are discussed in terms of declining social trust, or polarization, or the role of social media, or attraction to the authoritarian personality, but that people's lives are missing something. I think that way of talking is something that cultural critics, Catholics in particular, have focused on, religious thinkers, Jewish thinkers. But I think that way of thinking, that there are felt needs that are not being satisfied, is itself a way of beginning to conceive of the problem that may generate some possible solutions. But I don't have a sort of magic 8-ball where I know how to solve these problems. But I suspect stakeholders and helping people become stakeholders in their own lives, I don't know how one does it economically, but I think that would matter.
Diego Palirulo, you had a question? Are you still with us?
Hi, yeah. Sorry, thanks very much for, first of all, Professor Jaffe, great talk, very interesting. I have a few observations, somewhat questions that I wanted to ask. One is basically, there was a, today's populism is often associated with a certain exclusive understanding of citizenship. Okay, you have this, we see more and more that, nativism and xenophobia, this is something that is typical of today's populist movements. Now, is there, in your opinion, somewhat something of a parallel with what was going on in the classical world in terms of, you see that, Athenian democracy was, had a somewhat restrictive understanding of who was entitled to be free and participate in democracy. So is there a kind of parallel that you see? And if I can expand a little bit more, there is another related development that has somewhat challenged our understanding of representative democracy nowadays, which is technocracy, okay, which is somewhat the opposite in a certain way of representative, of populism. Again, do you think that there is some kind of lesson about technocracy that the ancient work can teach us? And one final observation is, if we look at American history, we see that often populist uprisings are followed by social reforms. So one final question is, what do you think that there is some kind of, is this conception of patriotism that is somewhat sometimes put forward by populist movements? Is there anything good, anything that can provide some kind of impetus for social reform, in your opinion? And that would be my question. Thanks very much for letting me ask the question and for this wonderful talk. Thanks.
Thanks, Diego. Diego's a colleague in my department, so it's nice to see him here. I would say this, Diego, so you're certainly right that a certain form of nativism attends some right-wing populism. But in the United States, for example, the left-wing populism of, say, Bernie Sanders defines the people not in racial or ethnic or cultural terms, but as the working class. And I've heard it said, and I think it's right, that the way in which we construct the people matters a great deal. Right populists, the community of reference, this is from Pierre Menant, but I think it's accurate that right populists tend to define the people, or the community of reference for right populists is the nation, some imagined community or understanding of an organic community. But for left populists, it's often rooted in economic classes. So I think this issue of the construction of the people is important. At the same time, there is a way in which the people are understood to have enemies, whether those enemies are immigrants, whether those enemies are a billionaire class, The people have enemies. And so I do think there is something fundamentally oppositional in the establishment of this category, the people who need to be defended over and against who. And there's always a who. There's always someone that is preventing the people from, you know, achieving those things that the people deserve or want to achieve. I do think in ancient Greece, and this is where there are real differences between ancient Athens and obviously modern America, which is to say you have a homogeneous society in ancient Greece. There might have been a sense of Greekness, certainly after the Persian Wars, a sense of common cause among even Dorians and Ionians. The Spartans were Dorians, the Athenians were Ionians. And so there was a difference between Greeks and barbarians. At the same time, there was not the kind of cosmopolitanism that characterizes much of the modern world, or that characterizes much of, say, European sensibility or much of American sensibility, a cosmopolitanism rooted in the belief that all human beings have rights. And I do think that populism suggests, if not something Schmittian, in the sense that the categories of self and other or friend and enemy are somehow, these categories inhere in the character of political life. I do think populism suggests or exists in tension with some of the claims of left cosmopolitanism. By saying that, I don't mean that left cosmopolitanism is false. I just mean that it's running into political problems in the world. You see this in Europe, Diego, as you well know. You know, the immigration crisis really risked fracturing Europe because it provided space, the refugee crisis, for various politicians in places like France and Italy and elsewhere to, in an entrepreneurial way, appeal to the fears and concerns and anxieties that Italians or Greeks or the French had about immigration. So I do think there's a problem with, or there rather, populism suggests a discomfort or a tension with cosmopolitanism. Onto technocracy. I think this is another way in which we feel the world is out of our control. You certainly see this in the European case as well. For Plato and Aristotle, right, knowledge is a title to rule, and democracy in its original form was based upon a faith that ordinary people were capable of ruling their own lives. And I think here again, Tocqueville makes the relevant point, which is if I'm the owner of a small business and someone's about to build a road, a major road near my small business, I pay attention. I think about it. I think about the regulations that affect me. I attend school board meetings because my kid goes to that school. And I can make good decisions about things that are within the sort of the angle of vision of my ability to pay attention to them because they're bound up with my life. But when things happen thousands of miles away, I lose the ability to see the effect of policies. And so as we live in an increasingly complex world, one where we need technocrats to make decisions in a world of increasing complexity, I do think that citizens increasingly feel out of control, and our desire to be in control is bound up with our worry or lack of trust of technocrats making decisions for us. So I think I would use technocracy to sort of double down on the pathologies, the real political pathologies that are arising as a result of the felt sense that our world is no longer in our control. Not a perfect answer, it's a complicated question, but maybe I'll take another one and you and I can talk about social reform at a future point over an espresso in Rome.
Okay, that was great. Thanks very much, really.
All right, I think we'll have to leave it there. Everyone, thank you so much for attending. It was a real pleasure for me, and Professor Jaffe, thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Seth.
Thanks, Carly.
Sorry about the toddler walking around in the background.
No. You have to propitiate the tyrant, always important.